Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a live edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Monday, the 13th day of March in the year 2017, and it's hard to believe that we're actually here live for a change. We've had some real issues with internet problems and various other things over the past week, and I apologize for that. But hopefully, because we as everybody knows, we've got kind of what they're calling a gargantuan storm that is going to be beginning in this area sometime overnight tonight. And the predictions of snowfall along the East Coast are pretty heavy and pretty frightening. But so we don't know exactly what the issue is going to be in terms of power outages and various other things over the next 24 hours. But we'll see what happens, and we'll make the best of it. So welcome to a live edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I keep referring to it as being live, and I keep saying, I hope I'm alive. I hope that we can stimulate this. I did want to make a comment, which I think is quite interesting, for me at least, is that on Saturday, which was the 11th of March, we began our fourth year of programming here at the Virtual Center. So this today is our first program of the fourth year that the Virtual Center will be with you. Our first program was on the 11th of March in the year 2013. So it's hard for me to believe that we do have on the archives well in excess of 250 hours of live programming, and it's amazing. If anybody had told me at the front end that we were going to reach that kind of a number, I wouldn't have believed it. But here we are, and so I did want to call your attention to that because I think it's pretty neat, to be honest with you. I would love to hear from you. It's been so long since we've been live on the air, and we haven't talked to some folks for a long time. I would love to hear your reactions to some of the things that are happening in the world, in the nation, in the world around us. There's been a lot going on, and hopefully we'll kind of get back into the swing of things, as they say, and see if we can nail down some of them. We do have a phone number, and it's been a while, but we really do solicit your willingness to pick up the phone, give us a call, come on the air, and share your thoughts, your concerns, your hopes, your fears, whatever, with our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to drop me an email, one-on-one, and express yourself that way in an email, I would be honored for you to do that. I would love to hear from you. I will acknowledge receipt of your email, and depending on what you say, if it seems to be something that our listeners would benefit from, then I would like to reserve the right to share it with our audience. I will tell you, however, that I will do the very best I can. If indeed I'm putting your ideas, your thoughts on the air, I will do the very, very best I can to accurately represent your interests and your intent. I'm not going to do any editing or anything else of what you say or what you write. So, I know that some people are reluctant to go on the air and express themselves on the air. I can understand that. So if you'd like to feel more comfortable doing it in an email to me directly and trusting me to get your thoughts out there for other people to benefit from, then I really do invite you to drop me an email. The address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. Again, I do remind you of our Facebook page. I have continued, even though we haven't been on the air, I have continued to make use of our Facebook page to put some thoughts, my own thoughts, and on issues of the day for your reaction on Facebook. There are opportunities there for you to comment on some of these things. And I've also included a number of articles. I've put the link on the Facebook page along with some of my own commentary about the particular article and why I think that it's well worth your time to look seriously at this particular article. In fact, a couple of the items that we'll be dealing with at the beginning of our program today are the results of issues or things that I put on Facebook rather recently. So with that, welcome to the Virtual Center on this, the 13th day of March in the year 2017. And again, please feel comfortable at any time during the program to pick up the phone and give us a call. Agnes is in the studios of the Head On Radio Network. She'll answer the phone. She'll get you on the air. She'll, buzz me or alert me that you're there. We'll get you on the air. And I promise you that I, first of all, I'm not comfortable doing this anyway, but I will never set out to argue with anyone, or I don't mean argue necessarily, but I will disagree occasionally. I don't mean that. But I'm not going to set out to attack or criticize anybody. I'm more interested that you get your thoughts and your ideas out there. So please feel free to do that. The number again, 304-663-4676. I've had a particular item on my desk for a number of days, and I just wanted to share this with you. Bob Kincaid actually sent me this a while ago, and he wanted me to be aware of this, and that is a bill that was proposed in the Arkansas House, in the Arkansas legislature, House Bill 1834, which is an act entitled, and I'm reading this directly from the copy, an act to prohibit a public school district or open enrollment public charter school from including in its curriculum or course materials for a program of study, books, or any other material authored by or concerning Howard Zinn and for other purposes. In a sense, then, Section 1 of this proposed legislation in the state of Arkansas would prohibit the use of materials written by Howard Zinn in any of the classrooms in the state, public classrooms or public charter schools. And Bob had run across that and wanted me to have a copy of it because I think he realizes, some time ago we've done a couple of programs on Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, of course, is the author of The People's History of the United States. He's considered to be among our more noted so-called radical historians, if you want to call it that. My reaction when I received this notice from Bob on the Arkansas proposed piece of legislation was a recollection that the state of Indiana did the same thing a few years ago. At that time, the governor of Indiana was Michael Pence. And he basically promoted and pushed this anti-Howard Zinn strategy through the legislature in the state of Indiana. So this is not unprecedented. Without going into a lot of detail on Howard Zinn, I would suggest to you that Howard Zinn is presenting material which provide alternative ways of looking at issues and items that appear in our textbooks. Oftentimes, establishment folks find Howard Zinn's presentation uncomfortable, disturbing. I've always found it exhilarating. And the reason is, from an academic point of view, because Howard Zinn forces us to look at issues we thought we knew for sure in totally different ways. It forces us to confront alternative ways of looking at information and historical events. It doesn't necessarily mean that in encouraging people to read Howard Zinn, you are asking people to memorize or buy into or adopt the Howard Zinn strategy or perspective. Rather, it's a way to confront people's prejudices by presenting material and information in different ways and raising questions about what people believe. I'll probably get into this later in our program on another issue. But I think I've mentioned numbers of times previously, and I think right now is a good point to mention it one more time. The issue of religion in our classrooms, the issue of the Bible in the classroom, for example, which has been an ongoing issue throughout American history. And Jefferson and Madison's determination to keep politics and religion separate. If the purpose of a classroom, a school classroom, is to learn, is to think, then by definition, issues related to beliefs run contradictory to the issue of cognitive thought and analysis. If the school merely presents the same information in the same ways that people go into the classroom believing about those particular issues and events, then the whole purpose, the whole point of the educational experience is merely to reinforce people's belief system. In reality, true education requires that these beliefs be challenged. That's why religion really doesn't have a part to play or a role to play in an educational setting, because you're encouraging people to think. And if you present material based on what people believe, then by definition it's contradictory or runs counter to the need to think at all. It merely reinforces people's belief systems. That's the issue. That's why Howard Zinn, I believe, is such an important asset. The implication is that Howard Zinn somehow is not a competent historian. The reality is that that is not true. Howard Zinn is an incredibly accomplished historian. What concerns a lot of people, especially those people with influence and power over curriculum, what disturbs people is that the issues that Howard Zinn presents and the ways he presents them, more specifically, the questions that Howard Zinn raises, are questions that need to be raised. But if you exclude him from the classroom, they never will get raised. So the question is, do you want legitimate thinking to go on in our classrooms, or do you want our classrooms to merely be restatements of things that people already think and already believe coming in? I would suggest to you that's the nature of the way we have traditionally approached public education in this country. You can remember back in the early 19th century when a proposal was made in the United States Senate to impose a high tariff on foreign books, on books coming into this nation from overseas. And the assumption was that if you tax these books, then chances are people won't buy them. People won't read them. And so consequently, the dangerous, un-American ideas that they contain will never make it into the classrooms in this country. As early as 1815, members of the United States Senate who promoted this particular legislation really believed that their role as elected representatives was to shield young people and protect them from dangerous foreign ideas. The fact of the matter is, if people are really going to learn to think and analyze and evaluate and assess, they have got to look at differing, competing approaches to the same kinds of issues. If you only have one that's accepted and you exclude all others, you are not educating anybody, you are controlling minds. You are deadening the educational experience. You're killing the intellectual curiosity of young people. And unfortunately, that's what's behind this kind of legislation. The thinking is that young people ought not to be exposed to the perspectives and the kinds of issues that Howard Zinn raises about slavery, for example, about treatment of Native Americans by early colonists and explorers, British and Spanish and other explorers from Europe. The assumption is that our history becomes much more comfortable for some people if young people never are exposed to the idea that Native Americans were exploited, that Native Americans were considered to be less than human beings. Those are the kinds of issues that Howard Zinn emphasizes. By banning his books, the thinking is that we are banning these ideas and thereby shielding our young people from ideas that we would prefer they not ever be exposed to. Very, very anti-intellectual, very dangerous to the substance and the quality of a meaningful education experience. And again, the fact that this particular legislation was introduced in Arkansas, we need to be aware that it was introduced in other places as well. And a couple of years ago, when he was governor of Indiana, current Vice President Michael Pence pushed similar legislation through the Indiana legislature as well. So I just thought I'd mention that. Bob gave me that piece of information some time ago, and we haven't had the opportunity to ever visit it here on the virtual center. So I wanted to do that. I mentioned at the beginning of the program, at the beginning of the hour today, that I wanted to deal with a couple of things that were on Facebook. Let me begin with one, because the issue that is obviously getting all the attention over the last several days, of course, is the issue of health care. More particularly, the issue of repealing and replacing Obamacare with a program that the Republicans are pushing now called American Healthcare System, or American Healthcare something. I can't remember the exact title of the legislation they're pushing. But Paul Ryan and the president himself, Donald Trump, are pushing this particular legislation. There's a lot of opposition to it. There's opposition from Democrats. There's opposition from conservative Republicans. Conservative Republicans don't believe that the legislation goes far enough. Many of those people who, for the first time in their lives, have some sort of health care insurance as a result of the Affordable Care Act, are frightened to death that they're going to lose it under this legislation. And so the debate goes on. And one of the things that has, and I put this on Facebook a week ago, but one of the things that has really disturbed me about this entire debate, and I heard Paul Ryan say the same thing yesterday when he was interviewed on, I believe it was Meet the Press, about this particular legislation. And the implication, of course, and this is the point that he makes, is that Obamacare is in decline, that Obamacare is failing, and ultimately people are going to be left with nothing if the Republican majority doesn't move in with a replacement. So from Paul Ryan's perspective, the issue facing people is this particular plan or nothing. Basically what he's saying is the Affordable Care Act is failing. Insurance companies are pulling out in too many places around the country. There's only one provider. There's no choice. Costs are escalating. Copays are escalating. The amount of coverage is decreasing. And so ultimately, Paul Ryan and the Republicans in Congress are pushing very hard for the adoption of this piece of legislation. Conservatives, on the other hand, and I'm thinking specifically of Rand Paul, but as you know, there are others in the House and the Senate, believe that it doesn't go far enough, that in effect, this particular House bill does not repeal the Affordable Care Act. It retains significant portions of it. Not only that, but it phases in the gradual demise of the Affordable Care Act. So what that means is the full brunt of this particular legislation, should it pass, is not going to be felt until the year 2020. Conservatives believe that that violates the promise that Republicans made to the voters when they promised that the first item on their agenda, should they be elected in November, is to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something else. Conservatives are arguing that the something else that is being proposed to replace it is really not a replacement at all. That much of what they believe to be the worst aspects of Obamacare are being retained in this new legislation. Tax credits being the major difference, if you will, between this piece of legislation and the Affordable Care Act. And of course, the other thing is that the Affordable Care Act is tailored specifically, is the amount of subsidies that citizens get in order to supplement their health insurance is based principally on their income. This new legislation pegs tax credits to one's age. The thinking obviously being that as people get older, they are much more likely to need and use health care. Therefore, the tax credits, the subsidy that they get, increases with age. And so the debate goes on. I'm hearing it. I know you are hearing it as well. It's very confusing. There's one issue in all of this that seems to me screams for attention because it's almost never mentioned. And that is the issue of cost. The idea being that the purpose of this kind of legislation is to lower the cost, as President Trump said, lower the cost, increase access, and improve coverage. I'd like to focus on the issue of cost because nobody ever does that. The issue at hand is whether, in fact, the costs of healthcare are legitimate. The one thing we see in all of these debates and discussions is the basic assumption that our challenge is to come up with a plan that best enables us to meet the costs of healthcare. The assumption being that those costs are legitimate. I would suggest to you that that is an issue which needs attention. On Facebook, I refer to this issue of cost as the 800-pound gorilla that's always in the room whenever the discussion turns to reforming healthcare. The issue is cost, pricing. I would suggest that in all the discussions and all the debates, nobody seems to be questioning the legitimacy of the costs. Rather, they're focusing on the best way to pay them. In a sense, what that means is whatever the market will bear in terms of cost, that's what pharmaceutical companies and medical professionals are charging. I raised the question on Facebook. Do you remember Martin Shkreli? He is the CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals. He's the one that so many people became familiar with recently because of the high costs of the drug Taraprim, which is a prescription medication for acute malaria. If you remember, Martin Shkreli and Turing Pharmaceuticals raised the price of Daraprim, the medication, from approximately $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill. And he was charged, Turing Pharmaceuticals was charged with gouging the public. And in an interview, Shkreli said that his major mistake during all of this kerfuffle over the price was that he didn't raise the prices even higher. He made the point in an interview that his job as CEO is to represent the shareholders, not patients. The company that he headed is in the business of making money, he says, not in the business of making sick people well. His conclusion, his job as CEO was to raise the price as high as he could possibly get away with. And the fact that he didn't do it and only raised it a portion of the way up, as it were, he felt was his only mistake. Just recently, within the last month or so, the same issue came up over a prescription treatment for multiple sclerosis. For years, multiple sclerosis patients were being prescribed a drug called Avonex. It was produced overseas, primarily Great Britain. And those people with MS who were prescribed Avonex were paying about $10,000 a year for that prescription. However, the drug was taken over by a different company, and a new drug came out called Tecfidera, and the price for that was in the neighborhood of $66,000 a year. So in a sense, MS patients were being gouged. They were being denied access to medication that had been costing them $10,000 a year and forced to buy medication that was costing them well over $65,000 a year. And then, of course, there's a case, especially here in West Virginia, that most of us know all about, the case of EpiPen, produced by Mylan Pharmaceuticals in Pittsburgh. The CEO, the president of Mylan Pharmaceuticals, is the daughter of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. And if you remember, EpiPen is a medication for severe allergies. It's injected. 2 injections as of 2007, when Mylan Pharmaceuticals bought the rights to EpiPen, 2 injections of EpiPen cost about $100 in 2007. Mylan Pharmaceuticals raised the price to over $600 for 2 injections. Eventually, the pressure on Mylan was so great that Mylan agreed to come out with a generic form of EpiPen for half the price. Still, however, the cost increased from $100 in 2007 to $300 for the generic. In all of these cases, pricing decisions were being driven by what the market would bear. More specifically, by how much desperate patients were willing to pay. The issue, I'm arguing, is that pricing in this aspect of healthcare eludes common sense. While political leaders debate and discuss the Affordable Care Act and alternatives to it, there's one ugly reality that few of them ever mention: the need to do something about corporate greed. We are in a political environment today with the election of Donald Trump, which runs counter to the issues of regulating prices. In a sense, then, patients in our healthcare system, whatever it is, are increasingly going to be subjected to prices that will clearly be inflated to as much as the market will bear. The desire to control pricing is not there. It's not in Congress. It's not in the White House. It's not in the media. It's never even discussed. The prevailing assumption seems to be that whatever the cost of the particular medication or medical service is, it's legitimate. Basically, we're being told that things like competition is the only way to control prices, and that the market's ability to offer more choice is really what's going to keep pricing under control. That's the argument that Paul Ryan, Donald Trump, and the others are using as they work to push this new replacement legislation for Obamacare. The fact of the matter is, citizens need to know, they are aware if they will just look at it, that the bottom line for corporate providers, for corporations in the field of healthcare, what is driving the healthcare debate is not the health of patients. It's profit. And if there are not going to be controls and regulations on the amount of money that healthcare costs, then it seems to me that there's no way in the world to reform healthcare. Which leads me to to the argument that Paul Ryan is continuing to make, Michael Pence is making it as well, about the fact of choice. That the more choice patients have, the cheaper healthcare is going to become. In other words, people are being encouraged to have inordinate faith in the ability of the market to regulate pricing. I would suggest to you that if that worked, then the issue of government regulation of prices would never have become an issue in the first place. The reason that there has been regulation is because providers have been unwilling to control prices, to allow the price to be an accurate reflection of cost. We're not talking about the legitimacy of profit here. Everybody knows that in a free market system, reasonable profit needs to be an expectation. That's the way our economic system must work. Stockholders must have faith that when they buy stock in a particular company, that they have some expectation that the value of the stock will improve. In the medieval period, the Catholic Church used to preach all the time about the dangers and the threat of usury. Illegitimate, unfair interest being charged. The church's position was that interest is legitimate, but exorbitant interest is usury, and the church defined it as a sin. Obviously, the fact that governments have seen fit to regulate prices is an indication that labeling usury as a sin didn't stop anybody from charging whatever the market would bear. So again, it seems to me, if we are going to get a handle on the costs of healthcare, it's going to begin with a serious effort to match price with cost, the cost of development, the cost of delivery of a particular service. The fact of the matter is that pricing is so difficult to get a handle on that controlling cost overall becomes almost impossible. And that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room during all of these debates. The assumption being that whatever a particular service or a particular drug or prescription costs, that price is legitimate. The reality is, much of the time, it is not. It is driven by what desperate people will pay. And when you get that particular formula driving our healthcare system, cost is determined by what people are willing to pay, then the reality is that there are significant numbers of citizens who can't pay. There are a few who can pay. But the reality is there are too many who cannot. And ultimately, healthcare decisions then come down to who can afford to be healthy, and dealing with the reality that many people can't afford to be healthy. This is the only developed society on the face of the earth which does not guarantee healthcare services to its citizens. In this country, healthcare has been and remains a commodity. It's driven by the market. Price is determined by the provider. And the nation is scurrying around trying to find a way to come up with a plan that will permit patients to pay what are often exorbitant prices. It seems to me that there's a legitimate place in this conversation, in this debate, for the issue of legitimacy, for the issue of balance. Nobody's questioning the right in a capitalist system for providers to make a profit. The difference is how much profit crosses the line from legitimacy into becoming illegitimate pricing. And if we believe that much of the pricing within healthcare is not legitimate, then the next question is, how do we rein it in? How do we reform it if there's no way to control price? It seems to me that that is what I've referred to as the 800-pound gorilla in the room during all the debates and all the discussions about health care. I say this because that debate is raging right now as the Republican majority in Congress pushes this new replacement bill in order to, as it claims, fulfill its promises to the voters to repeal and replace Obamacare. Nobody is mentioning the issue of price, of cost. And I think back to the issue, the issue which used to be called business ethics, medical ethics. Why is it that medical ethics governs the behavior of physicians, but ethics is nowhere to be found in the pricing of services and prescription drugs? I think it's a legitimate issue. It screams for attention. It's getting none. And I believe that to be very, very unfortunate. A second issue that I'd like to address, and I did this on Facebook just yesterday. Many of you who are regular users of Facebook will be aware, will know, that every once in a while, Facebook, the folks at Facebook, will present or run a posting that you posted a year ago or 5 years ago or whatever. Yesterday, on the 12th of March, I got a notice on my Facebook page that just 1 year ago, on the 12th of March 2016, I had posted a piece on the election campaign as it was taking shape last March, before the conventions, when none of the nominees were decided. This was the period in which Donald Trump was one of 17 candidates for the Republican nomination, if you can remember. And of course, there were much fewer than that in the Democratic race. I reread the piece that I wrote a year ago. And it was about something that we've called, and other people call as well, the Trump phenomenon. The fact that significant enthusiasm was bubbling for the candidacy of Donald Trump. And while a lot of people, as of March 12th last year, were writing Trump off as a serious candidate, as a candidate with any chance at all of getting the nomination, there was more and more evidence surfacing that this might not be true. One of the things I recognized yesterday is the value of hindsight. Hindsight is not defined or listed as 20/20 without reason. If you look back to what we were saying a year ago about Donald Trump, and now we know what's going to happen. We know that Donald Trump's going to be elected in November. And this gives a whole new meaning to the things we were speculating about 6 months prior to the election. It gives us some insight as to why history, so-called, repeats itself, or the value of history. It seems to me that if we had taken more seriously some of the things that we were speculating last spring, then the results might have been different. At least people wouldn't feel that they were blindsided by the election victory of Donald Trump. I made the comment in my posting yesterday that it's almost eerie to dwell on the informative pieces of research that were presented in the run-up to the election at a time when we couldn't know what the outcome would be. I find that this is very revealing. And so basically, what I thought I would do today, briefly, is just mention some of the things that I was talking about a year ago. Because now we're looking from the perspective of post-election reality. We know that Donald Trump is president of the United States. So the things that we were speculating a year ago have come to pass. Here's what I wrote 12 months ago. And this is, I'm quoting myself here. Looks like the explosion of emotions that has been simmering for so long between those lining up behind Donald Trump and those frightened by Donald Trump has finally happened. That Chicago was the place is both ironic and understandable. Is this going to be 1968 all over again? Or is there more to it this time around? I said a year ago. For many years in my American history classes, I used to use an old 1970 article of Psychology Today, from Psychology Today, in order to spark student interest in understanding the politics of the 1930s. We'll be back to this later, by the way. More particularly, I used to focus on a particular phenomenon that intrigued investigators after World War II, the idea of the authoritarian personality, which became very prominent in the 1930s. Driven mostly by fear, not only of real threats, but the kinds of changes that expose us to the unknown. The authoritarian personality seeks security in the strong leader. It is then not so much the desire for power as a desire to connect to power in search of security. The authoritarian personality, we've talked about this since, the authoritarian personality is not a quest for power per se. It's a quest for security, for safety. And one's conclusion is that the safest place is under the shadow and protection of the strong personality of the powerful. It is not unexpected, psychologists concluded, that Tarzan and Superman, both comic strips, became popular in the 1930s. It's not an accident. What was there about the 1930s that caused people to become captivated by Tarzan and Superman comic books? You can understand an awful lot of the 30s by trying to figure out what it was about these strong, super male personalities of Superman and Tarzan, and why people tended to gravitate towards that particular personality in the 1930s. People were scared. What was going on in the 1930s? It was the Depression. People were losing their homes. 25% of the workforce was out of work. Europe looked like it was cranking up for another war. The citizens of Germany elected their own strongman, Adolf Hitler. Italians went to their strongman, Benito Mussolini. Russia, after the revolution, sought protection and security in communists, specifically in the person of Joseph Stalin. And here in the United States, in 1932, the American people looked to their own strongman, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and his promise of a New Deal. It's not too far a stretch, too much of a stretch, to say what Roosevelt claimed for the New Deal is quite the same as what Donald Trump promised about making America great again. The same kinds of circumstances and situation in the country caused people to look to the strong personality that seemed best able to produce answers. People were losing faith in everything they thought was secure. They turned to those that they believed could best deliver order, produce order. Quote, CBS News found in an exit poll after the South Carolina primaries last spring that 75% of Republican voters in the primaries supported banning Muslims from the United States. 33% of Trump supporters supported banning gays and lesbians from the country. 20% said that Abraham Lincoln should never have freed the slaves. And I raised the question on the 12th of March last year, is this what Donald Trump is all about? Think about it. Back to the article from a year ago. Back in 2009, in a book entitled Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler conducted research, this is in 2009, conducted research that seemed to predict the rise of Donald Trump. The GOP, they concluded, by positioning itself as the party of traditional values and law and order, was attracting what turned out to be a vast population of Americans with measurable authoritarian tendencies. As early as last March, researchers were already beginning to recognize that the people who were most supportive of Donald Trump for the nomination were people who tested positively for the authoritarian personality. Their insecurities were being reflected in their politics. NYU's Jonathan Haidt has written, I said last year, that the dynamic social changes underway in America today seem almost like a button push that says, quote, in case of moral threat, lock down the borders, kick out those who are different, punish those who are morally deviant, unquote. Jonathan Haidt of NYU a year ago made the comment that what we were seeing in America, in our politics, was almost as if somebody pushed a button that said, in case of moral threat, lock down the borders, kick out those who are different, punish those who are morally deviant. Final paragraph from last March's article. In a national poll, shortly after Donald Trump won New Hampshire, researchers found that 44% of white respondents nationwide scored high or very high as authoritarians, 19% very high. 65% of those who scored highest on authoritarian questions were GOP voters. 75% of those who scored the most non-authoritarian were Democrats. This is the conclusion that I put on Facebook just yesterday. I think that what we have here is a solid lesson in the value of understanding the past. So often, it helps us understand the present and predict the future. Media gurus are filling our newspapers and airwaves with speculation as to what is driving President Trump to say and do the things we see each and every day, often in his tweets. Had we taken what researchers were telling us a year ago more seriously, we'd not be at all surprised by what's happening now. More importantly, if Hillary Clinton's campaign people had paid more attention to it, we'd likely be looking at a totally different reality in 2017. It's unbelievable the degree to which things we could only speculate upon a year ago, now with hindsight being 2020, were so predictable. What we were speculating has indeed come true. And as more and more of us wonder and worry about what's driving this, where's it coming from? It seems to me if we can look back just a year, we can begin to recognize that a lot of people were giving us signs of the things that were likely to come. But since they were only guesses, it was only speculation, I guess it was too easy to not take seriously. Today's reality suggests that we should have done that. We've just passed the top of the hour. It's 3 minutes after the hour, 3 minutes after 2 Eastern Daylight Time here in the East. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll engage in another hour here at the Virtual Center. Let me just say that I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to be on this program today. After missing so many because of the power outages we had and the internet being down at the Head On Radio Network and all the rest of it, I know Bob Kincaid was going crazy trying to get service so that we could continue to produce programs. And now that things are back up and running, here we are facing yet another weather issue. But I think we'll have to deal with that when the time comes. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our second hour. Please stay tuned, and thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here on today's Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on what it's right now overhead a beautiful day here in Appalachia. It is chilly, but it is clear and sunny and hardly an indication of what's to follow in the next 12 to 15 hours, I guess. But if you're just joining us, welcome to the program. We've been trying to do some catching up in our first hour. We looked at a couple of things that were posted, that I posted on Facebook. We were kind of looking at the issues related to healthcare, the debate that's going on about healthcare. and I'm sure we'll be back to that because this one's not going away for a while. All the indications, all the records, all the data indicates that with this new program, many people are going to lose their health care, and many people know it. They're showing up at these public sessions, and they're being promised access. And again, access goes to those with money. And the subsidies that are being talked about, $2,000 for the young, $4,000 for the older folks to use toward their health care, I would suggest to you, there's no health care policy that I know that's any good that you can get for $4,000 a year or $2,000 a year or anything else. I know in my own case, I have, and this is straight from, it was work insurance, but in order to continue it after my retirement, it's costing me close to almost $7,000 a year for that. So basically, that's about 25% of my total income is currently with healthcare. So I think this is really what a lot of people are looking at. So this is very, very important. Welcome to our program here at the Virtual Center. We sure are glad you were able to be with us today on this 13th day. And again, I'll mention what I mentioned at the beginning of our first hour. Today is the first program in our 4th year of doing programs here at the Virtual Center. Our first program was done on the 11th of March, 2013. So the 11th of March, 2017 was Saturday. So today is the first program of our 4th year. I think that's exciting. I hope you agree with me as well, because it's because of you that we're even there. Our phone number. We do have a phone number. We do encourage you to come on the air and share your thoughts with us. We would love to hear from you. I mean that. Our other listeners would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you would be more comfortable by dropping me an email and trusting me to get your thoughts on the air, then by all means, I welcome receiving your email. I do encourage you to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. The reason I spelled my last name is because a lot of people spell O'Brien I-A-N. Mine is I-E-N, and it's important because that one little letter will cause you to not be successful on the internet. And finally, I mentioned to you our Facebook page. I do encourage you to take a look at it. The articles that we talked about in our first hour appeared on Facebook, and in fact, the issue that we're going to be dealing with first here in our second hour is on our Facebook page as well. If you are a regular user of Facebook, you know how easy it is. Just go to the homepage, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be onto our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings there that I put on, links to articles that I thought were particularly significant. And I'm basically putting them on there and giving you the opportunity to react, to comment, however you choose to respond. That's really what the Facebook page is all about. The purpose is not to just give me an opportunity to sound off on some of these things, but hopefully to create the kind of complexity in some of these issues, which give you the opportunity to react and weigh in on some of these things yourself. It's kind of ironic that the first issue I'd like to deal with in today's second hour, in our second hour here, deals specifically with the internet. More specifically, it deals with the issue of addiction. Translation: those people who are virtually addicted to the internet. I see it all the time. I know you do. The number of people that are addicted to Facebook. The number of people that can't wait to check on the Facebook 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times during the course of a day. People who need that like when they put something on Facebook and somebody that they know, a friend, responds by saying that they like it. Sometimes they even respond by making a comment about what you've put on Facebook. We seek those likes. You hear the advertising all the time in the media. Follow us on Twitter. Like us on Facebook. The fact of the matter is, many people need that like. They need that kind of feedback. In yesterday's New York Times, one of the regular columnists, Sunday columnists, is Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat wrote a piece entitled Resist the Internet. Let me read you the first sentence, 2 sentences of his article. So far, in my ongoing series of columns, making the case for implausible ideas, he said, I've fixed race relations and dealt with a workless working class. Now it's time to turn to the real threat to the human future, the one that's in your pocket or on your desk, the one you might be reading this column on right now. And here's the relevant paragraph. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. You are enslaved to the internet. Definitely if you're young. Increasingly if you're old. Your day-to-day, minute-to-minute existence is dominated by a compulsion to check email and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram with a frequency that bears no relationship to any communicative need. No relationship to any communicative need means we're not doing this because we feel the need to communicate with other people. We're doing this because we're driven to know whether other people are communicating with us. And that's our need. Compulsions, Douthat says, are rarely harmless. The internet isn't the opioid crisis. It's probably not going to kill you unless you're hit by a distracted driver or leave you ravaged and destitute. But it requires you to focus intensely, furiously, and constantly on the ephemera that fills the tiny little screen and experience the traditional graces of existence. Your spouse and friends and children, the natural world, good food and great art in a state of perpetual distraction. That's the issue that Douthat takes on in his column yesterday, is the issue of trying to come to grips with, deal with the addiction that for many has become the internet. Douthat acknowledges that the internet brings value to our lives. All of us could make a positive argument about the positive contributions that our lives have gotten as a result of the internet. This is what Douthat says, quote, used within reasonable limits, of course, these devices offer us new graces. But here's the problem. We're not using them with reasonable limits. They are the masters. We are not. They are built to addict us. As the social psychologist Adam Alter's new book, Irresistible, points out, and to madden us, distract us, arouse us, and deceive us. We primp and we perform for them as for a lover. We surrender our privacy to their demands. We wait on tender hooks for each and every like. The smartphone is in the saddle and it's riding mankind. Unquote. Think about that last sentence. The smartphone is in the saddle and it rides mankind. It's frightening. But the reality is it speaks to a truth that most of us would never admit. But it's there. As I mentioned, it would be easy. All of us could make a solid case in support of the internet. That it's giving us more than it's taking from us. I wonder, though, and I think this is Douthat's point, is what the internet is doing to us. Think about our politics. Think about Donald Trump and his tweets, about the power that he wields by having immediate access to 26 million Americans on his Twitter account, about the ability that this gives him to do end runs around the institutional checks and balances built into our Constitution. Checks and balances, separation of powers, all those things that we grew up learning about and relying on as checks on runaway power. All of them negated by Twitter. By the fact that the president can wake up in the morning and in 140 characters or less communicate directly with 26 million people instantaneously. Fact is, and this is a quote from Douthat's article, there are also excellent reasons to think that online life breeds narcissism, alienation, and depression. That it's an opiate for the lower classes, and insanity-inducing influence on the politically engaged. And that it takes more than it gives from creativity and deep thought. Think of what the internet does or doesn't do in its relations, in its connections to creativity, to people's ability to think deeply on a particular subject. Think about Twitter and the limits of 140 characters, which means that you say what it is you need to say in the most direct, shortest way possible. There's no depth. There's no analysis. There's no recognition of things like implications, inference, intent, implication, outcomes. There's no time for any of that. It's just instant communications. Saying what you've got to say in the shortest way possible. Notice what Delthart says about different groups of people. The internet, he says, is an opiate for the lower classes. And its insanity-inducing influence on the politically engaged. His suggestion here is that the internet has a different impact, a different effect on people depending on who you are, how well you're educated, how well you have been able to build up your defenses against the addiction that the internet becomes for so many. For the lower classes, it's an opiate. Remember Karl Marx and his use of the term for religion as the opiate of the people. The implication of that is that people's commitment to a belief system means that they have stopped thinking. They have stopped looking for truth. And instead, they have given in to the idea that somebody else can tell them what truth is. The mere fact that you have faith that somebody else has the truth and can give it to you automatically means that you don't have to put forth the effort of finding it for yourself. It makes you intellectually lazy. But it does more than that. It makes you vulnerable to the arguments and to the faith you have in the ability of those in whom you believe to tell you what's truth, to tell you what's true, and thereby save you from the labor necessary to find out for yourself. Why read articles and books when you can go to other people who've read those articles and books, and in a very few words, they've told you what the essence of the content of those articles and books is all about? They are telling you what's in those articles and in those books, which means that you don't have to go and read them for yourself. You don't have to think. All you have to do is believe, absorb. You have ceased to be a thinking individual, and instead you have become a believing individual. Numerous times I've made the comment, and I sometimes wonder whether the meaning of this is as clear as I think it is. The founders, when it came to religion, the founders believed that truth was discovered, never revealed. Think about that. Truth is to be discovered, not revealed. If you believe that truth can be revealed, then you are allowing someone else to define it for you. If you believe that truth must be discovered, then the burden is on you to put in the sweat equity to discover it for yourself. If people can tell you what to think, knowing that you'll believe what they tell you without question, then they control you. Because they can spin the truth that they give you in ways which will most appeal to you. In effect, they can predetermine the outcome that they want from you. And they can manipulate the truth in such a way that they'll get it. You'll respond exactly as they want you to respond every time, because you have stopped thinking for yourself. You have become intellectually lazy. I would suggest to you that probably more than anything else, that defines our educational system. Our educational system is designed and organized principally to keep people intellectually lazy by saying you don't need to go out and read all these things for yourself. Just take this textbook and memorize what's in it. Other people have done all that sweat equity. There's no reason you should do it. I would suggest, and Douthart is suggesting, that that's part of the addiction of the internet. It's doing damage to our ability to be creative and to engage in deep thought. Primarily, it delivers information to us. It delivers conclusions to us. But there's no way in the world it can transfer the thought that went into those conclusions to you. And the fact that Douthart recognizes that different people react in different ways to the internet is significant. The fact that it becomes an opiate for the lower classes and has an insanity-inducing influence on the politically engaged. The implication is that different people with a different agenda are affected in different ways by the internet. Douthart makes the point that in Silicon Valley, where there's more money than anywhere else in the country, parents can buy whatever they think their kids most need. It's revealing that parents in Silicon Valley are choosing to send their kids to places where there isn't any technology. Like, and this is a quote, like the Silicon Valley overlords who send their kids to a low-tech Waldorf school, unquote. The people who can buy the best for their kids make sure that the education their kids are getting is not internet-driven. It's not smartphone, iPhone, or laptop-driven. So what's all this stuff about public education being increasingly dependent on technology when the people who can afford the best won't go near it for their own kids? This is personal. In the year 2000, 17 years ago, my step-granddaughter, my stepson's daughter, graduated from West Point with a degree in nuclear physics. And when she was in school, when she was at West Point, I was quizzing her as often as I got the chance on education at West Point. West Point obviously has a reputation as being one of the top academic institutions in the country. And I was very interested in how her classes were set up. what she told me 17 years ago is something that I've repeated frequently. I've never forgotten. She said, everybody who comes to West Point as a freshman must have a computer. But you are not permitted to bring that computer to class, ever. Classroom time is learning time. Computer time is research time. You do that on your own time, not on the classroom time. How different that is from what we see happening in our classrooms at all levels. Kids with iPhones, laptops, telling their instructor that they can take good notes by typing on their laptops, when in fact they're looking at email, they're searching Facebook and all of these other things instead of learning. She said, by all means, everybody had to have access to a computer, but the institution forbade students bringing their computer or their laptops to class. Because what West Point was saying is that this digital revolution, as it were, does not enhance learning, it inhibits it. Yet we continue to buck the evidence. Our school systems are buying into technology and getting breaks on laptops and iPads, and increasingly using them in the classroom, when in fact the people who know best have already told us that this technology inhibits learning. It doesn't promote it. But we continue to move in that direction. It's a good way to keep kids engaged in class. It's a good way to convince them that they're learning, but in reality, they aren't learning much. I mentioned an hour ago, more than an hour ago, in comments about Howard Zinn, that we would be back to this. What Howard Zinn makes available to us in his approach to American history is the kind of alternative perspective that forces us to deal, to resolve conflicting points of view. It's in solving the conflicting, resolving the conflicts, that education happens. We have to do it. In order that thinking will happen, there needs to be alternative perspectives presented. If only one perspective is presented and defined as truth, then the only alternative for students is to memorize that truth. I would suggest to you that's been the major approach in our public education system. But the reality is, and this is what Russ Douthat points out to us, the people who have the money and can afford the best don't allow that to happen in the education of their children. But somehow they invest in companies which demand it for our children. I think there's a message there somewhere. And I label, or I put Howard Zinn in that same category. It dawned on me, and I didn't do this in our first hour, but I've just pulled Howard Zinn's book off the shelf just to look at the table of contents and some of the things Howard Zinn presents in his treatment of American history. This People's History of the United States, 1492 to the present. Chapter 1, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Chapter number 2, Drawing the Color Line, the Racial Basis of Slavery. Chapter 3, Persons of Mean and Vile Condition, the Masses, the Working Class. Just jumping down, Chapter 8, We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God. Chapter 9, Slavery Without Submission, Emancipation Without Freedom. Chapter 11, Robber Barons and Rebels. Chapter 14, War is the Health of the State. 15, Self-Help in Hard Times. And on and on and on. This is the book that the state of Arkansas does not want your kids to read. I think the analysis or the explanation of that is pretty much self-evident. In our last program, we've got about 20 minutes left in today's program. The last time that we were live here at the Virtual Center, which was before we ran into the storm problems and the internet problems and all the rest of it, we were dealing with some in-depth understanding, effort to understand, let me put it that way, of Stephen Bannon, President Trump's personal advisor, if you will, on both foreign and domestic policy. He's kind of a mystery. He's not been very visible. In fact, there was a feature article in Sunday's Washington Post yesterday about Bannon's background and the fact that he seemed to be a nomad. He had addresses everywhere, but he seemed to live, vote, and pay taxes nowhere. He was kind of a mysterious shadow that moved from state to state. There's evidences that he is listed as having 3 different residences in the state of Florida alone. That's in addition to residences in New York and California and other places as well. We were spending time trying to understand Stephen Bannon because it is becoming very, very clear as we move into the end of the first month and the beginning of the second month of the Trump presidency. We're beginning to recognize the inordinate influence that Stephen Bannon is having on the president and on the policies he articulates and supports. And that's where we were. More specifically, and we'll be into this tomorrow, hopefully, because I think it's going to take much more time than the 20 minutes. But if you'll recall, we had been looking at an article by Neil Howe It was an article that appeared in the Washington Post on February 24th. Neil Howe is co-author of a book that was published in 1997, the title of which is The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. Again, let me give you the title of that book. It is called The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. It is co-authored by Neil Howe and the other author's name is Strauss, and I'm looking for his full name. William Strauss. Neil Howe and William Strauss. Strauss passed away in 2007. So now Neil Howe is the only author left living. And what this article in the Washington Post is about their book, because it became very clear that Stephen Bannon, much of his thinking, much of his objectifying, much of his analysis was driven by this book. He obviously was extremely influenced by this book, which means, of course, that so also is Donald Trump, because of the influence that Stephen Bannon seemingly has on him. So again, the message is clear. If we recognize the influence that Stephen Bannon is having on President Trump, then it stands to reason that it would be well worth our while to see if we can get a handle on what is driving Stephen Bannon. And more, it's become obvious that this book by Neil Howe and William Strauss, The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy, is the book in question. Basically, and let me give you share with you a quick summary before we go into any depth on this. Checking my materials here. I had a summary of Neil Howe's book. Here it is. Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, is based upon the theory, or his theory, of what we call historical cycles. The basic idea that history goes through a series of cycles, and that those cycles will come back and repeat themselves periodically. Bannon himself says, and Howe says, as the author of this book, they reject the idea that history happens in a linear fashion, that one thing happens after another, after another, after another. Rather, Howe buys into what traditional societies have always believed. And that is that history happens in cycles. Certain circumstances produced certain results. And if you look back over history, you find examples of the same kinds of circumstances producing the same results over and over again. It's a cyclical approach to history. What defines a traditional society is a society which has most of its attention on the past rather than the future. Traditional societies, by definition, are very suspicious of change. They're much more comfortable doing the same things they always did, the same things that their fathers did, and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. In other words, the more the past is repeated over and over again, the more comfortable traditional societies become. When change is proposed, traditional societies become very nervous because you're into uncharted territory. You don't know what might happen, but the thinking is you do know what did happen. And the way to build security, the way to protect yourself, is to make sure that you continue to do the same things in the same way in order to make sure that the same things happen in the same order in which they happened before. And that's really the premise of Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning. In this book, Howe and Strauss argue that history happens in a series of turnings, and that each turning constitutes a generation. And they measure it this way. They basically suggest that a well-lived life, a full life, is a life that extends for about 80 years. Therefore, they believe that each generation of that life constitutes 20 years. And so every life, in theory, that lived to its fullest incorporates or includes 4 turnings of 4 generations. And as one generation passes into the next one, as people age, they move from one situation into the other. The way that Howe explains it in his book is imagine the 4 seasons. Imagine the first season is spring, the second is summer, the third is fall, and the fourth is winter. They believe that history operates in that same kind of cyclical fashion. And that consequently, if you look back over history, you look at the characteristics of a particular period of time, and you can determine by that exactly what generation or what turning that particular society is in during that 10-year period, during that 20-year period, or during those 2 decades, if you will. But even more impressive about this particular cyclical approach to history, spelled out by Howe and Strauss, is the fact of its predictability. That not only can you apply this approach to understanding the past, but the fact that the cycles repeat themselves over and over again in 80-year cycles means that you can pretty well predict that one turning is going to lead logically to the second turning, to the third turning, and ultimately to the fourth turning. And so consequently, each turning, if you will, each generation is characterized by very similar circumstances. This is the explanation that Howe uses. The first turning he defines as the high. The third, the fourth as crisis. And he said you can look back through history and you can see each of those playing out in the past. Howe himself says, history is seasonal and winter is coming. You know, as sure as you know anything, that the first turning is going to logically lead to the second turning, which in turn is going to lead to the third turning, which in turn will bring you to the fourth turning. It's the description of these turnings, of these phases, that really constitutes the essence of the book. And as we move towards the end of our program today, we have about 3 minutes left in our program, so we can't go too far. But let me try to bring this particular portion of it to a logical conclusion. If you know that one turning is going to be logically followed by the next, if it's predictable, because history shows us that the same cycles repeat themselves over and over again, then that makes it possible to use this theory or this model as a way to predict the future. Karl Marx, in his Communist Manifesto, believed that there were certain truisms in history that were beyond question. He believed that capitalism as an economic system contained the seeds of its own destruction. That eventually the concentration or the emphasis on property, on wealth, and competition for that wealth increasingly meant that more and more of a society's wealth is going to be controlled by fewer and fewer of its people. That the very nature of the system not only creates winners, but also creates losers. And the result is that as you proceed, the losers increasingly outnumber the winners. And so you end up with a situation where most of the wealth is under control of a very few people. And the vast majority of people fall out of the ranks of the property classes, the bourgeoisie, into the ranks of the working class or the proletariat. Marx predicted then that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction. That as capitalism progressed, as more and more people became propertyless, and fewer people began to control more and more of the property, at some point in time, the many would rise up to overwhelm or overtake the few. In other words, there was going to be a revolution. It was inevitable, Marx said, because the seeds of it were sown into the very essence of capitalism itself. History happened in cycles, and the communist revolution was as predictable as anything could possibly be, Marx believed. That's the same kind of thing that Bannon believes, based on this book by Neil Howe and William Strauss. Here's the kicker. Along in communism, along came Lenin. Lenin believed that there was nothing wrong with helping the revolution come faster. There was no reason to just wait for it to happen of its own accord. There was nothing wrong with doing all you could to hurry it up. Bannon believes the same thing about Neil Howe's fourth turning. But we'll get back to this tomorrow. Our day is up. We've run out of time. Thank you for tuning in to today's program on the Virtual Center. I invite you to be back with us tomorrow, same time. Actually, not the same time. We'll be starting 1/2 hour later tomorrow, Tuesday. Again, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be kind to each other, and thank you.